2002 through 2006 Cadillac Escalade rear brake pads and rotor replacement. I'm Brian Eslick from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you through the steps of replacing those. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in the hood here, take the cap off the master cylinder and suck out a couple ounces of the brake fluid. One of the easiest ways to do that is with a turkey baster. I'll explain why we're doing this a little bit later on in the video. Next, we need to get the vehicle up in the air and remove the rear wheels. If you're doing this at home, use floor jacks and jack stands. I'm going to use the new Milwaukee half-inch drive impact gun. It makes life so much easier working on cars with this tool. So I'm working on the driver's side here, and I'm going to remove the two bolts holding the caliper on. To do that, I'm using a 12mm ratcheting wrench. This wrench is about 18 inches long, and it makes jobs like this really easy. It's made by Mountain. I'll link this up in the description of the video, that way you can check this out. So we need to remove the 12mm bolt here and here. So as you're cracking this bolt free, the inner pin may spin on you, so you may have to back it up with a wrench. So what you do is use a 16mm wrench and slide it over the backing slide pin here, and that'll hold it from spinning so you can get the bolt out. So after removing the top and bottom bolt on the caliper here, the next step we need to do is take the caliper off, and it may be stuck on the brake pads here. So what I do is use a little flat blade screwdriver or a small little pry bar like this, and you can either pry right here, or actually where it's a little easier to pry is right here. And what you're doing is, as you pry against the bracket here, it pushes the pistons in just a little bit and gives it a little bit of slack to get the caliper off. So once you get the caliper off, you can just kind of rest it up on top of the suspension here. And you don't want it hanging from the hose or anything. Just let it rest up here out of your way for right now. So now we need to remove the caliper bracket. And to do that, we need to remove the two 18mm bolts here and here at the bottom. To remove those bolts, I'm going to use my 18-16 combination wrench made by Mountain here. Like I said, this is about 1.5 foot long ratcheting wrench that makes jobs like removing these types of bolts and fasteners really easy. That's why I use them and have them in my collection. And because they're so long, it makes removing these fasteners really easy. So it's easy to put a lot of torque on these wrenches and crack bolts like this free. You can use a standard ratchet and socket. It'll definitely fit in. Or you can even fit an air ratchet in here if you got one. But you'll most likely have to break it free with a wrench or a ratchet first before you use an air ratchet on it. So once you get the bolts removed, go ahead and take the bracket and set it aside for now. We'll prep that later. Now we need to remove the rotor, and these like to stick on the hub. So what I do is take a hammer like this and strike the rotor a couple strikes, and that'll jar the rotor loose. It likes to get stuck on the hub here. And since we're replacing them, I'm not worried about damaging them. So once you get it free like this, you can go ahead and pull the rotor off. Now once you got the rotor off, we need to inspect the park brake shoes. These shoes like to come apart and the peel off on here, so you want to inspect and make sure the park brake shoes are in good condition. If they're not, you'll have to replace that. But these park shoes are in great shape. So what I'm going to do now is just clean up the hub here. So I'm using some sandpaper, a little 80 grit sandpaper, to sand the hub here and get any surface rust. That way our new rotor fits nice and snug on the hub here. Before we install the new rotor, I like to take a little bit of brake clean like this and spray down the old park shoes here and clean up all the brake dust that builds up in here and road grime and everything, and get that cleaned out. That way the park brake works efficiently. We're also going to adjust these brakes to make sure that the e-brake works. You're going to want to have a bucket to catch the runoff when you clean this up. So I'm going to be installing OE pads and rotors on this vehicle. These are the part numbers for the parts. I will link these up in the description of the video also. So these rotors come spray painted with a special paint that helps break in the pads and seat the pads. But if you got aftermarket rotors or a different brand, they may have oil on them, and that prevents them from rusting on the shelf. You'll need to wash that off with soap and water or brake clean. So now I'm going to slide the new rotor on and check the adjustment. And if yours is out of adjustment, you'll have to adjust this little star wheel right here. And you can either pry against the axle here and adjust it this way, or against the backing plate like this and adjust it this way, depending if you need to loosen it or tighten the park brake. So you'll slide your new rotor on over the hub, and you'll spin the rotor, and if it spins super freely, you'll know the park brake needs to be adjusted. You may find the adjuster here to be a little tough to move with the spoon, and you can use pliers on the adjuster here to screw it in or out to adjust the park brake. So when you're adjusting this, you want to check the little gap here, and as you turn it one way, you'll see it get narrow, or you'll see it widen. So as it's widening, it's tightening the brake up. If it's narrowing, it's loosening the brake up. So I'll put the rotor on, spin it, and if it needs to be adjusted, I'll pull it off, adjust it a few clicks, put it back on and spin it again. And what I'm looking for is a light drag on the rotor. You don't want to over adjust it. You would just want a slight light drag on it, and that's all you need. Now we're ready to prep the bracket here, so we're going to remove our old pads here and remove the hardware also. The OEM pads come with all new hardware. These are the part numbers for the OEM pads. I'll link these up in the description also. So we're going to install the new hardware that comes with the kit onto the brackets here. Before I change out the hardware, what we need to do is pull these slide pins off and lubricate them and make sure they're operating freely. So you peel the little boot back right here. You may take a screwdriver to peel the boot back, and then you pull the slide pin out. Then what you're going to do is wipe off all the old grease, and you're going to inspect these pins and make sure they're not all rusted up. If they are, you may need to replace the caliper brackets or calipers. So after getting the slide pins all cleaned up, I like to take a little bit of brake cleaner and spray it into the into the holes here on the bracket here and try to get out some of the old grease. Then after that, what I do is take some of this grease that's specially designed for working with brakes. So I'll put a little dab of that onto the pins and work that grease into the pins. And then what I'll do is I'll slide the pin with all the grease on it back into the caliper bracket here and work the grease back and forth in the caliper bracket and make sure that it's operating freely. And I'll do that for both top and bottom pins. Once you get the top and bottom pins cleaned up, then you can go ahead and peel off the old hardware like this and transfer on new hardware, match it up with the old one, and then transfer it over to your caliper. If that channel underneath the bracket was rusted up or corroded, you can use a wire brush or clean it out, and if it's in really bad shape, you still may have to replace the bracket. So now we're ready to slip the bracket back on. Before I start the bolts, what I do is I take a little bit of red thread locker and put it on the threads. And this is like a glue that helps prevent these bolts from vibrating loose and coming back off. I'll put a link for the thread locker and the grease in the description of the video also. So after starting the two bolts and running them into their snug, we need to torque them down. And we're going to torque those bolts down to 122 foot-pounds. And I'm going to use a torque wrench obviously to do that. When I'm torquing these bolts down, I don't like to jerk the torque wrench. I like to give it even pressure, and that gives you an accurate torque. Now we're ready to install the brake pads, and the little metal squealer here faces downwards like this. So you'll put the inner pad in first, you'll line it up and just push it on until it fully seats onto the bracket like this. Then we'll install the outer pad with the squealer pointing downwards also, and you'll just line up the bracket like this. You may have to twist it a little bit or angle it a little bit to help get it started. It's kind of a tight fit. But once you get it in there, after that, I use a little bit of that brake grease made by Seal Glide, and I put a little dab of that on the back of the shims here. You make sure you don't get it on the face of the brake pads, just on the back of the shims, and this helps reduce any vibrations and squeaks. And I'll put that on the inner and outer pad. So now you want to inspect your brake calipers. If the boots are torn or if you think it's leaking fluid or anything, you'll have to replace the calipers. So now we're going to push the pistons back into the bores. I'm going to use an old brake pad like this. And I'm going to use what they call a dual piston caliper tool to press that caliper back in. And it just hooks, kind of hooks onto the caliper like this. And it's like a caulking gun. You'll squeeze the handle, and as you squeeze the handle, it pushes the pistons back in. And you may notice I did not open the bleeder screws when I'm doing this. And that was the reason why we took out some of the brake fluid at the very beginning of this video. So as we push these pistons back in, some of the brake fluid will go back up into the master cylinder. And if it was over full, it would spill out into the engine bay. Doing it this way, we will not have to bleed the brake system. But we will have to pump the brake pedal after we get it all reassembled. So now that the pistons are pushed back in, we're going to change out this little part of the hardware here, and this puts pressure on the pads and keeps them from rattling and vibrating. So I'm just going to use a little flat blade screwdriver here to pry it. So I flip the caliper back over here, and there's a little tab right here, and I just put the flat blade screwdriver in between and then pop the old piece out. To install the new hardware, we kind of put it in at an angle like this, and then push it downwards until it seats into the caliper. So after getting the hardware installed, now we need to put the caliper back on over the bracket here. As you're doing this, you want to make sure that the brake hose is not twisted. So you'll slide the caliper on over and make sure the hose is not twisted. Now we're ready to install the bolts. The kit came with brand new bolts with thread locker already on it. If you got an aftermarket set of brake pads, it may not come with the bolts, so you'll need to put red thread locker on the bolts and then bolt it back up, and that'll prevent that bolt from vibrating loose and coming back off. So after installing top and bottom bolt, I installed the 16mm wrench on the slide pin here to back it up, and then we're going to torque the bolts down to 31 foot-pounds. Once again, you don't want to jerk the torque wrench, you want to do it in even pressure. Now you can go ahead and install your wheels and torque the lug nuts down to 140 foot-pounds. After that, you can duplicate the same process on the opposite wheel. Before we drive the vehicle, you need to pump the pedal 4 or 5 times, and that gets the fluid back into the calipers and gives you a nice firm pedal. If you don't do this step, when you first hit the brakes, you'll have no brake pedal. After that, you need to double check your fluid level. And I also wanted to mention, after pumping your brake pedal and you still have a funny feeling pedal, then you may have to bleed the brake system. But doing it this way, you should not have to bleed it. I will link up all the tools and parts that I use in this video in the description. That way, if you need to pick up any of those, you can find that there. I'm Brian Eslick from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos, encourage you to subscribe, invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. I'd like to thank you again for watching.